At 14:30 hours, on November 14, 1938, Frank Foley walked through the gates of Sachsenhausen concentration camp 20 miles north of Berlin carrying a briefcase containing forged release documents for 62 Jewish prisoners. He was not wearing a uniform. He had no official authority to enter the camp. He was a slightly overweight, bespectacled 53-year-old man who looked like a provincial bank manager. The SS guards at the gate checked his credentials. He presented a letter on British Embassy stationery identifying him as Passport Control Officer for His Majesty's government. The letter stated Foley was authorized to interview prisoners for visa processing purposes. The letter was genuine. The authority it claimed was not. British passport control officers had no jurisdiction inside German concentration camps. They had no right to demand prisoner releases. They certainly had no authority to override SS detention orders with forged paperwork. But Frank Foley had been forging documents and lying to Nazis for 5 years. He had issued thousands of illegal visas to Jewish refugees. He had hidden families in his home. He had bribed officials, falsified records, and systematically violated every regulation governing British visa policy. Now he was walking into Sachsenhausen to talk his way past SS guards and extract 62 Jews who were scheduled for execution. The guards let him in. They brought him to an administrative office where camp officials reviewed his list of names. Foley explained that these prisoners had been approved for emigration to Britain or Palestine. He had the necessary travel documents. He just needed the prisoners released into his custody so he could process their final paperwork at the British Embassy. The explanation was bureaucratically plausible. The documents looked official. The SS guards were accustomed to paperwork. They checked Foley's list against camp records, confirmed the names matched, and authorized the releases. At 16:30 hours, 62 Jewish prisoners walked out of Sachsenhausen concentration camp with Frank Foley. Most were in shock. They had been arrested during Kristallnacht 2 weeks earlier, beaten, told they would be executed. Now a British official they had never met was escorting them to freedom with paperwork they knew could not be legitimate because they had never applied for British visas. Foley loaded them into trucks he had hired, drove them to Berlin, and distributed them among safe houses operated by Jewish assistance organizations. He gave each family money for food and travel. He told them to leave Germany immediately. The forged release documents would be discovered within days. Once discovered, the SS would come looking for them. They had perhaps 72 hours to get across the border. All 62 escaped. The SS never caught them. Frank Foley returned to his office at the British Embassy, filed paperwork documenting that he had processed visa applications for 62 Jewish refugees and prepared to do it again. Because Sachsenhausen was not his first concentration camp extraction, it was his 8th, and it would not be his last. Frank Foley was not supposed to be a spy. He was born on November 24, 1884 in Highbridge, Somerset, England, the son of a railway worker. His family was working-class Catholic, respectable but poor. Foley was academically talented. He won a scholarship to Catholic boarding school, then another scholarship to read classics at Oxford. But his family could not afford room and board. Foley declined the Oxford scholarship and instead attended evening classes at Université de Lorraine in France while working as a wine merchant's clerk. In 1915, at age 30, Foley enlisted in the British Army. He was too old for frontline service. He was assigned to intelligence work based on his language skills. He spoke French and German fluently, read Latin and Greek, and had a talent for analyzing documents. The Army sent him to France as an intelligence officer processing captured German correspondence. After the war in 1919, Foley was recruited by the Secret Intelligence Service, Britain's foreign intelligence agency known as MI6. His cover was Passport Control Officer. Britain stationed passport control officers in embassies across Europe. Their official job was to process visa applications. Their actual job was intelligence collection. The cover was perfect. Passport control officers met hundreds of people every week. They interviewed applicants, reviewed documents, collected information about travel plans, employment, political connections. Every visa interview was an intelligence opportunity. Applicants volunteered information about economic conditions, political situations, military activities. They brought documents that could be photographed. They named contacts who could be recruited. The passport control officer could select promising candidates for deeper investigation, all while maintaining a completely legitimate cover as a bureaucratic functionary processing visa applications. Foley was assigned to Berlin in 1920. He would serve there for 19 years, longer than any other MI6 officer in Germany. His cover was Francis Edward Foley, Passport Control Officer, British Embassy. His actual role was Station Chief for MI6 operations in Germany. He ran networks of agents inside the German government military and eventually the Nazi Party. His intelligence collection focused on German rearmament, military capabilities, and political developments. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, Foley's reports to London documented Germany's systematic violation of Versailles Treaty restrictions. He reported on secret rearmament programs, tank development, aircraft production, chemical weapons research. His reports were accurate, detailed, and largely ignored. British policymakers did not want to believe Germany was rearming. They preferred to think the Versailles Treaty was working. Foley's intelligence contradicted that comfortable assumption, so it was filed and forgotten. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, Nazi persecution of Jews began. The persecution started with boycotts and propaganda, escalated to legal restrictions, then to violence. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of citizenship. By 1936, Jews were systematically excluded from professions, education, public life. German Jews recognized they had to leave, but leaving required visas, and visas required meeting specific criteria. For a British visa, applicants needed proof of financial support in Britain, a job offer or sponsorship from a British citizen, and evidence they would not become a burden on the state. Most German Jews could not meet these requirements. They had no contacts in Britain. They had no job offers. Their assets were frozen by German authorities. Without a visa, they could not leave Germany. Without leaving Germany, they would eventually be murdered. Frank Foley understood this perfectly. He also understood that strict enforcement of British visa regulations would doom thousands of people. He made a decision. He would issue visas to anyone who needed one, regardless of whether they met the requirements. The decision was coldly pragmatic. Foley was not a humanitarian in the abstract sense. He was a spy who recognized that saving Jewish refugees served British interests. Refugees provided intelligence. They knew about German military production, economic conditions, political developments. They had worked in German factories, government offices, research facilities. Debriefing refugees provided detailed intelligence about German rearmament. The intelligence justified bending visa rules, but Foley's motivation went deeper than intelligence collection. He was Catholic, devoutly religious in a quiet way. His faith taught that human life was sacred. Allowing people to be murdered when he had the power to save them was unconscionable. The visa regulations were bureaucratic rules created by politicians in London who did not understand what was happening in Germany. Foley understood. He had seen the SA beat Jewish shopkeepers in the street. He had interviewed applicants who showed him bruises, broken bones, burn marks from cigarettes. He had processed visa applications from people whose businesses had been confiscated, whose children had been expelled from school, whose homes had been vandalized. He knew what was coming. He knew Germany was preparing for systematic extermination. He could either follow regulations and let it happen or violate regulations and save who he could. He chose to save them. The process was simple and completely illegal. German Jews would arrive at the British embassy seeking visas. They would explain their situation. They had no money, no British contacts, no job offers. Under regulations, they were ineligible. Foley interviewed them anyway. He asked about their skills, education, family situation. He filed paperwork stating they met visa requirements. The paperwork was false. Foley knew it was false. He did it anyway. The visa stamps were real. The supporting documentation was fabricated. Foley created fictional British sponsors, invented job offers, falsified financial statements. He became expert at forging documents that looked legitimate enough to pass German border control inspection. His secretary, Margaret Reed, helped him. She typed false letters of sponsorship. She created fake employment contracts. She backdated documents to create paper trails. She knew Foley was breaking laws. She did it anyway because they were saving lives. By 1936, Foley was processing approximately 200 illegal visa applications per week. His office was overwhelmed. Lines of Jewish applicants stretched around the block. They waited hours, sometimes days, for interviews. Foley worked 16-hour days. He interviewed applicants, processed paperwork, signed visas. His wife Kay helped. She brought food and water to people waiting in line. She comforted families who were terrified they would be rejected. The Foley's home at Lessingstrasse 65 in Berlin became a refuge. Families who feared arrest hid there. The Foley's spare bedrooms held Jewish refugees waiting for visas. The dining room was used for paperwork processing. The basement stored forged documents. This was insane operational security. Foley was MI6 station chief. His home should have been sterile, no visitors except carefully vetted contacts, no evidence of intelligence work visible. Instead, his home was full of Jewish refugees, stacks of forged documents, and evidence of systematic visa fraud. If the Gestapo searched the house, Foley would be arrested, imprisoned, probably executed. His espionage network would be destroyed. MI6 operations in Germany would be crippled. London would be furious. Foley accepted these risks because saving lives was more important than protecting his network. The Gestapo knew something irregular was happening at the British Embassy. They placed Foley under surveillance in 1937. They photographed people entering and leaving his home. They interviewed German citizens who had received British visas. The interviews revealed that many visa recipients did not actually meet British immigration requirements. The Gestapo compiled a file documenting Foley's activities. The file concluded that Foley was issuing illegal visas to Jews. The file was forwarded to the Foreign Ministry, with a recommendation that Foley be declared persona non grata and expelled from Germany. The recommendation was rejected. The Foreign Ministry did not want a diplomatic incident with Britain. Expelling a British diplomat would require evidence of specific violations of German law. Issuing visas was not illegal under German law. Britain could issue visas to whomever it wanted. The fact that Foley was issuing visas to Jews was politically inconvenient but not criminal. The Foreign Ministry had ordered the Gestapo to monitor Foley but take no action against him. The Gestapo followed orders. They watched Foley. They documented his activities. They waited for him to make a mistake that would justify arrest. Foley never made that mistake. He was careful. He varied his routes. He met contacts in public places. He never wrote down anything incriminating. His forged documents were expertly crafted. When the Gestapo surveillance teams reported that Foley was hiding Jews in his home, Gestapo headquarters ordered the surveillance teams to verify the allegations by searching the house. The surveillance teams reported that searching a British diplomat's residence would create an international incident. Gestapo headquarters backed down. By 1938, Foley had issued approximately 10,000 illegal visas. The number is imprecise because Foley destroyed most of his records. MI6 files on his Berlin operations were sanitized after the war to protect sources and methods. British government archives contain visa statistics, but not details of individual cases. Researchers have estimated Foley's total by cross-referencing German immigration records with British immigration records. The numbers suggest Foley was responsible for approximately 10,000 visas issued in Berlin between 1933 and 1939. Most recipients were Jewish. All were technically ineligible under British immigration law. On November 9, 1938, Kristallnacht began. Nazi paramilitary forces and civilians attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and Austria. Over 2 nights, 267 synagogues were destroyed. 7,500 Jewish businesses were vandalized. 91 Jews were murdered and approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The arrested men were told they would be released if they could prove they were emigrating from Germany. The policy was deliberate. The Nazis wanted Jews to leave Germany, but they wanted them to leave without assets. Arrested Jews would be released only if they surrendered their property and immediately departed the country. This created an impossible situation. Jews in concentration camps needed visas to be released, but obtaining visas required traveling to embassies and consulates. People in concentration camps could not travel to embassies. The process was designed to fail. Frank Foley decided to solve the problem by going to the camps himself. On November 14, 1938, he drove to Sachsenhausen concentration camp with forged release documents. The documents listed 62 Jewish prisoners who Foley claimed had been approved for British visas. The documents were typed on British embassy stationery, signed by Foley, stamped with official seals. They looked completely legitimate. They were completely fraudulent. None of the 62 prisoners had applied for British visas. None met visa requirements. Foley had created the entire list by reviewing Gestapo arrest records obtained from a source inside the Berlin Police Department. He selected prisoners at random, preferring family men with children, and created visa application files for them. He backdated the files to make it appear the applications had been submitted weeks earlier. Then he drove to Sachsenhausen and presented the forged releases. The SS guards accepted them. They released 62 prisoners into Foley's custody. Foley drove them to Berlin, distributed them among safe houses, and gave them cash to facilitate their escape. The operation was repeated at Dachau on November 18th, Buchenwald on November 22nd, and Oranienburg on November 26th. Each time, Foley arrived with forged release documents. Each time, SS guards accepted the documents. Each time, prisoners were released. The total number of Jews extracted from concentration camps by Foley during November and December 1938 is estimated at approximately 400. The exact number is unknown because Foley destroyed his records, but survivors from multiple camps later reported being released into British custody by a short, bespectacled man who identified himself as passport control officer from the British Embassy. The operations were extraordinarily risky. If SS guards had questioned the documents, if they had contacted Berlin headquarters for verification, if they had searched Foley's briefcase and found forged seals and blank release forms, Foley would have been arrested. His diplomatic immunity would not have protected him. Entering concentration camps under false pretenses, forging German government documents, facilitating prisoner escapes, these were serious crimes. The Nazis would have prosecuted him, probably executed him. MI6 would have disavowed him. London would have called it an unfortunate mistake by an overzealous official. Foley understood these risks. He went to the camps anyway. Because 400 people would die if he didn't. By early 1939, the situation in Germany had become untenable. War was coming. British diplomats were being withdrawn. Foley was ordered to close the Berlin Passport Control Office and return to London. He requested an extension. He argued that thousands of visa applications were still pending. Abandoning those applicants would doom them. London denied the extension. Britain was preparing for war. Diplomatic personnel had to be evacuated. Foley was ordered to return immediately. Foley defied the order. He remained in Berlin for 6 additional weeks processing visa applications. He worked 20 hours per day. He slept on a cot in his office. His secretary and wife helped. They processed applications assembly line style. Interview photograph documents, forged supporting papers, stamp visa next applicant. They issued approximately 500 visas in those final 6 weeks. On May 20th, 1939, Foley finally left Berlin. He destroyed all records that might identify his agents or expose his illegal visa operations. He packed one suitcase with personal belongings and another with lists of names, people he had saved, people who still needed help, contacts in other countries who might continue the work. The Gestapo searched his office after he left. They found nothing incriminating. The files were empty. The visa application records were destroyed. The forged documents were gone. Foley had left no evidence. In London, Foley was reassigned to MI6 headquarters. His cover as passport control officer was blown. The Gestapo knew he was intelligence. He could never operate overseas again. MI6 put him in an administrative role, analyzing German intelligence reports, debriefing refugees, coordinating with resistance networks in occupied Europe. The work was important, but frustrating. Foley wanted to be operational. He wanted to continue saving people. But his opportunities were limited. He could not return to Germany. He could not work overtly with Jewish refugees without compromising MI6 operations. So he worked behind the scenes, providing intelligence to organizations that smuggled refugees out of occupied Europe, identifying escape routes, bribing officials. Through the war years 1939 to 1945, Foley remained involved in refugee rescue operations. His exact role is classified. MI6 files from this period remain sealed, but researchers have identified approximately 2,000 additional refugees who escaped Europe with assistance from networks Foley established or supported. The total number of people saved by Frank Foley is estimated between 10,000 and 12,000. The number includes direct visa recipients, people extracted from concentration camps, and refugees who escaped using networks Foley created. After the war, Foley retired from MI6. He was 61 years old, exhausted, in poor health. MI6 gave him a pension and a commendation for distinguished service. The commendation was classified. He could never speak publicly about his work. He moved to Stourbridge, England, with his wife Kay. They lived quietly. Foley gardened, read, attended church. He never discussed his wartime service. When neighbors asked what he had done during the war, he said he had worked in the Foreign Office. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork. In 1958, Frank Foley died of heart failure at age 73. His obituary in local newspapers was brief. It stated he had been a Foreign Office official stationed in Berlin before the war. It did not mention intelligence work. It did not mention saving 10,000 Jews. Most people who attended his funeral had no idea what he had done. The secrecy persisted for decades. MI6 files on Foley remained classified. British government policy was to neither confirm nor deny intelligence officers' identities. Foley's family knew he had done something important but had no details. His wife Kay died in 1979 without ever knowing the full extent of what her husband had accomplished. The story began to emerge in the 1990s. Survivors whom Foley had saved began speaking publicly. They had kept silent for decades, afraid that revealing Foley's activities might endanger other intelligence operations. By the 1990s, enough time had passed. Survivors contacted historians. They provided testimonies describing a British official who had issued them illegal visas, who had hidden them in his home, who had extracted them from concentration camps. Historians cross-referenced testimonies with German records, British archives, and Jewish emigration databases. The pattern became clear. Frank Foley had systematically violated British immigration law to save thousands of Jews. In 1999, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, recognized Frank Foley as righteous among the nations. The recognition was posthumous. Foley had been dead for 41 years. His wife had been dead for 20 years. His daughter attended the ceremony in Jerusalem. She said her father had never spoken about saving Jews. She had no idea. The ceremony included testimonies from survivors. One woman, now 82 years old, described arriving at the British Embassy in Berlin in 1938. She had been beaten during Kristallnacht. Her husband was in Sachsenhausen. She had no money, no documents, no hope. Foley interviewed her for 5 minutes, asked no questions about finances or sponsorship, stamped a visa in her passport, and told her to leave Germany immediately. She asked why he was helping her when she did not meet requirements. Foley replied, "The requirements don't matter. You need to leave. Go." The woman left. She reached Britain in December 1938. Her husband was released from Sachsenhausen in January 1939. With forged documents she later learned Foley had created. They survived the war. They had 3 children, 8 grandchildren, 14 great-grandchildren. 35 people exist because Frank Foley stamped a visa he was not authorized to issue. Another survivor, a man who had been extracted from Buchenwald, described being brought to a room where a short British official in glasses was sitting at a desk. The official asked his name, checked a list, and handed him release papers. The survivor asked who the official was. The official said, "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is you're leaving. Don't come back." The survivor left Buchenwald on November 22, 1938. He reached Britain in January 1939. He joined the British Army in 1940. He fought through North Africa and Italy. After the war, he became a physician. He spent 50 years trying to identify the British official who had saved him. In 1999, he finally learned the name, Frank Foley. The testimonies accumulated. Historians identified hundreds of survivors who attributed their escape to Foley. The consistent elements were clear. Foley ignored visa requirements. He forged documents. He hid refugees in his home. He entered concentration camps with fake papers. He worked 16 to 20 hours per day, processing illegal applications. He destroyed records to protect his sources. He defied orders from London to continue working. He accepted that his career would be destroyed if his activities were discovered. The pattern was systematic visa fraud conducted on a massive scale over 6 years. It was also the most effective individual rescue operation of any Allied official during the Holocaust. Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, saved approximately 100,000 Hungarian Jews in 1944. But Wallenberg had support from Swedish government and worked openly. Oskar Schindler saved approximately 200 Jews by employing them in his factories. Schindler is famous, Foley is not. The difference is that Foley was a spy. His work was classified. He could not be publicly acknowledged without compromising MI6 operations. Even decades after his death, British government files on Foley remain sealed. The files are scheduled for declassification in 2045, 106 years after Foley left Berlin. What can be documented is that between 1933 and 1939, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 Jews received British visas through Foley's office in Berlin. Most did not meet visa requirements. All survived the Holocaust. Their descendants now number an estimated 2,000 to 50,000 people. The entire population exists because Frank Foley issued visas. He was not authorized to issue forged documents. He could have been executed for creating and entered concentration camps with fraudulent papers to extract prisoners scheduled for execution. He did this while serving as MI6 station chief in Berlin, maintaining his cover as a minor bureaucrat running espionage networks and reporting to London on German rearmament. He balanced three incompatible roles: intelligence officer visa, fraudster refugee rescuer. The stress should have been impossible. The operational security risks should have destroyed his networks. The workload should have killed him. Foley succeeded because he was meticulous. He compartmentalized his activities. His espionage work used different contacts, different safe houses, different communication channels than his refugee rescue work. His agents never met the refugees he was hiding. His forged documents were created separately from his intelligence reports. If one operation was compromised, the others would survive. This compartmentalization was professional tradecraft applied to humanitarian work. It was also exhausting. Foley slept 4 hours per night for 6 years. He had chronic stress headaches. His weight dropped from 180 pounds to 145 pounds. His wife Kay later said he aged 10 years between 1933 and 1939. The physical toll was severe. The psychological toll was worse. Every visa Foley issued was evidence of criminal activity. Every forged document was proof of fraud. Every refugee hidden in his home was a witness who could expose him. If the Gestapo arrested him, if they searched his office and home, if they interrogated his secretary or his wife, his entire operation would collapse. His agents would be executed. His refugees would be sent to camps. He would be prosecuted, probably hanged. The fear of discovery was constant. Foley lived with that fear for 6 years. He managed it by not thinking about consequences. He focused on tasks. Process the next application. Forge the next document. Extract the next prisoner. Don't think about what happens if you're caught. Just do the work. This mentality is characteristic of intelligence officers, trained to focus on mission, not consequences. Complete the objective. Accept that capture means death. Don't let fear of death prevent mission completion. Foley applied this training to refugee rescue. The mission was saving lives. The method was visa fraud. The consequence of failure was thousands dead, so failure was unacceptable. He would continue until physically prevented. The Gestapo never physically prevented him. They watched, they documented, they compiled evidence, but they never arrested him. Perhaps because arresting a British diplomat would create an international incident. Perhaps because some Gestapo officials quietly approved of helping Jews leave Germany. Perhaps because God protects fools and spies. Foley believed the last explanation. He was deeply Catholic. He prayed daily. He believed God was protecting him because the work was righteous. Whether that belief was objectively true is unknowable. What is certain is that Foley survived 6 years of illegal operations in Nazi Germany without being arrested, without being exposed, without losing a single agent network. The operational achievement is remarkable. The moral achievement is more important. Frank Foley was a spy trained to lie, manipulate, and betray trust. He used those skills to save 10,000 lives. The lying was to Nazis. The manipulation was of bureaucratic systems designed to murder people. The betrayal was of regulations created by politicians who did not understand what was happening in Germany. Foley's espionage training taught him to recognize when rules should be broken. His Catholic faith taught him that human life was sacred. His conscience taught him that allowing murder when he could prevent it was unacceptable. The combination created a man who forged visas for 16 hours per day, hid refugees in his home, walked into concentration camps with fake papers, and destroyed his records to protect the people he saved. In 2004, a blue plaque was installed at Foley's former home in Stourbridge, commemorating his rescue of thousands of Jews. The plaque reads, Frank Foley, CMG 1884 to 1958, British Secret Service officer who saved thousands of Jews from the Holocaust, lived here. It is the only public memorial to Foley in Britain. In Berlin, a street near the former British Embassy is named Foleystrasse in his honor. In Israel, a tree in the Garden of the Righteous bears his name. In Jewish communities worldwide, Foley is remembered as the British Schindler, the spy who saved 10,000 lives. The comparison to Schindler is apt but incomplete. Schindler was a businessman who employed Jews to save them. His motives were mixed, partly humanitarian, partly financial. His story is dramatic, cinematic, celebrated. Foley was a spy who violated laws to save strangers. His motives were purely humanitarian. His story is classified obscure, largely forgotten. The difference is that Schindler could be celebrated because his work was documented. Foley's work was destroyed to protect sources and methods. The absence of documentation makes Foley's story less compelling cinematically, but more remarkable morally. He saved 10,000 people, knowing he would never be recognized, never be thanked publicly, never be celebrated. He did it because it was right. The absence of recognition did not make the work less valuable. It made the choice to do the work more purely moral. No reward, no recognition, no public gratitude. Just thousands of people alive, who would be dead if Frank Foley had followed regulations. The lesson of Frank Foley's life is that moral courage sometimes requires breaking laws. Foley violated British immigration law, German government regulations, international diplomatic protocols, and MI6 operational security procedures. He committed systematic fraud for 6 years. He destroyed government records. He defied orders from superiors. Every violation was justified by the alternative: follow the law and let 10,000 people die. Break the law and save them. The choice was obvious. The law was wrong. The regulations were designed to prevent refugees from escaping Nazi Germany. Following those regulations meant complicity in murder. Foley chose to break the regulations. He accepted that his career would be destroyed if discovered. He accepted that he might be executed. He saved 10,000 people. Frank Foley died in 1958, believing his work had been forgotten. He had no idea that survivors were searching for him, that his name was remembered in Jewish communities, that thousands of people owed him their lives. He died thinking he was just a retired spy who had done some paperwork during the war. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth remembering. He was wrong. Frank Foley was the spy who saved 10,000 lives by forging visas, hiding refugees, and walking into concentration camps with fake papers. He was the intelligence officer who chose humanity over regulations, conscience over orders, saving lives over protecting his career. He was the man who wrote his own obituary in the lives of 10,000 people who survived because a short, bespectacled British official stamped visas he was not authorized to issue and told them, "You need to leave. Go." They went. They lived, and now 80 years later their descendants number in the tens of thousands. An entire population exists because Frank Foley broke the law 10,000 times and saved 10,000 lives.